Rain slicked the cobblestones outside Hargrave Hall as carriages arrived beneath a restless sky, their lanterns swinging like watchful eyes over the gathering nobility. Inside the grand estate, chandeliers glittered with ruthless brilliance, illuminating a ballroom prepared to display Lady Arian Hargrave's fate before she herself had agreed to it. She stood near the edge of the room, hands clasped tightly, trying to appear composed while whispers slithered through the air like thin blades. Her stepmother, Lady Marianne, glided among the guests with polished superiority, her gaze flicking toward Arian with a warning sharp enough to still any attempt at defiance. Although the evening had been advertised as a winter charity celebration, Arian sensed an agenda concealed behind every polite smile. Even the musicians played with a strange anticipation, their bows trembling ever so slightly, as though complicit in a scheme not meant for her ears. Arian's humiliation began the moment the musicians paused and Lady Marianne swept to the center of the ballroom with a fan unfurled in theatrical authority. At her signal, servants dimmed the lights, heightening anticipation among the assembled aristocrats. Arian felt a shift in attention before she saw the Viscount approaching. His age-worn hands folded behind his back as though preparing to inspect property rather than greet a future bride. The murmurs intensified. Several women gasped softly, their expressions a blend of pity and scandalous delight. The Viscount approached with a self-satisfied smirk, his powdered wig slightly askew, his breath already tinged with wine. Arian took a small step backward, her pulse fluttering against her throat. Lady Marianne lifted her voice with triumphant clarity, declaring that her beloved stepdaughter was honored to accept the hand of Viscount Redmayne. The announcement reverberated through the hall like a cruel strike of a gavel. Arian felt heat flush her cheeks, followed by a cold sinking weight. She had not consented. She had not even been asked. Her lungs tightened as the Viscount reached for her hand with an air of entitlement polished by decades of unchecked privilege. She drew back instinctively, and a collective gasp spread through the ballroom. The Viscount's eyes narrowed, his pride wounded by her refusal. Lady Marianne's smile stiffened, though her voice remained sickeningly sweet as she urged Arian to compose herself. The room's attention constricted around her like a tightening snare. The Viscount muttered something about youthful nerves, attempting to salvage dignity, but his veneer cracked as he leaned closer. Arian heard him whisper to Lady Marianne that he expected the girl to obey quickly once the marriage secured the Hargrave estates. His words, spoken without shame, sliced through Arian's composure. She realized she had become a transaction, a pawn traded for political leverage and inheritance. Her mother's memory felt impossibly distant, swallowed by the machinations of a woman who had long since replaced affection with ambition. Shame, sharp and suffocating, surged through her chest as she saw guests exchanging knowing glances. She felt herself shrinking beneath their scrutiny, as though her very name were being rewritten without her consent. The walls seemed to close around her. Music resumed, but its cheerful notes mocked the dread rising inside her. She stepped backward, bumping into a group of guests who recoiled as if scandal itself clung to her gown. Her heart hammered. She had to escape before her stepmother tightened the invisible chains around her. Turning swiftly, she slipped through the corridor that led toward the gardens, her breath quickening as she distanced herself from the murmurs and scrutinizing eyes. A servant reached for her arm, offering to escort her back, but she pulled away with a frightened shake of her head. Panic fueled her steps as she hurried through the dim passage, her slippers striking the marble floor with frantic rhythm. Behind her, voices grew louder, searching, approaching. Lady Marianne had sent men to retrieve her, men instructed to drag her back if necessary. Panic surged as she reached the outer gardens, the darkness broken only by flickering lanterns. She stumbled over wet gravel, desperate to find a path unclaimed by her stepmother's reach. The wind carried the sound of footsteps drawing nearer. She pressed herself against the trunk of an old yew tree, trembling as she listened to the searchers calling her name with false civility. Their lanterns bobbed through the garden like predatory fireflies. She clutched the edge of her gown, desperation rising like a tide she could not swim against. Then, through the blur of rain, she saw a figure approaching from the direction of the estate's outer gates. He moved with quiet authority, a tall silhouette framed by stormlight. She recognized him instantly, though she had never spoken to him. Alexander Blackwell, the Duke of Ravensworth, a man whose presence could hush conversations even in the most arrogant circles of London. He was rumored to be untouchable, a pillar of influence whose decisions shaped political tides. Why he was arriving at Hargrave Hall that night remained unclear, but the sight of him, calm, strong, and unexpectedly near, ignited a fragile spark of hope within her. Her breath caught as she collided with him, nearly collapsing from fear and exhaustion. His hand steadied her before he even saw her face, his reflexes guided by instinctive protectiveness. When he looked down at her, surprise flickered across his features, quickly replaced by concern as he took in her drenched gown, her shaking shoulders, the terror clouding her eyes. The footsteps grew louder behind her. She lifted her face toward him, her voice breaking as she whispered, "They're coming. Hide me, please." The words, fragile yet desperate, lingered in the air between them. For a moment the storm seemed to pause, waiting for his answer. Alexander studied her, recognizing both courage and vulnerability in her plea. He glanced toward the approaching lanterns, then back to the trembling young woman seeking refuge in his arms. Something unspoken shifted within him, a resolve crystallizing with surprising clarity. Without hesitation, he drew his cloak around her shoulders and guided her toward the shadows beyond the gate, shielding her from view. The rain intensified as he led her toward his waiting carriage, its lantern dimmed to avoid attention. She clung to the edge of his cloak, trusting him with a faith born not of familiarity but of sheer necessity. Her pulse steadied slightly under his guidance, as though his presence formed a calm center within the chaos. Behind them, Lady Marianne's men reached the garden path, calling Arian's name with feigned concern. But she was already slipping into the Duke's carriage, her breath trembling as Alexander closed the door behind her. He met the men's inquiries with composed authority, informing them he had not seen the young lady and suggesting they search the eastern grounds. They hesitated but dared not contradict a man of his stature. When Alexander entered the carriage and signaled the driver to depart, Arian felt the weight of her fear ease for the first time that night. She did not know what awaited her, nor what consequences her flight would ignite. But as the carriage wheels rolled into the storm-darkened road, she sensed that with this man, this unexpected ally, her fate had irrevocably changed. Dawn might forgive her. The Duke's decision to shield Arian began in silence, the kind that stretches like a drawn breath between two lives about to change course. When his cloak settled across her trembling shoulders in the dim interior of the carriage, she felt not merely protected but momentarily restored, as though someone had returned a fragment of herself she had feared lost forever. Alexander Blackwell spoke barely a word on their passage to Ravensworth Manor, yet the gravity of his presence steadied her. His reputation for unassailable composure preceded him, and she sensed that offering sanctuary to a young woman pursued by scandal would unravel the immaculate order he had long maintained. Still, he did not withdraw the protection he had given her in a moment of instinctive courage. Instead, he instructed his driver to depart Hargrave lands before any pursuers could converge, and the wheels clattered into the night with the urgency of a secret carried beneath the weight of society's relentless gaze. By the time the manor's lanterns glimmered through the lifting fog, Arian's heartbeat had eased, though not enough to dispel the echoes of fear. Alexander escorted her through the carved stone archway and into the soft warmth of the entrance hall, where candlelight shimmered across portraits of Blackwell ancestors who seemed to evaluate every visitor with austere judgment. The Duke's steward, an elderly man whose loyalty was carved as deeply as the lines upon his face, paused at the sight of the rain-drenched young woman. Before he could voice a question, Alexander removed the signet ring from his glove and placed it into the steward's palm. The gesture was bold, unmistakable. Arian was to be considered under the Duke's personal protection, a declaration that would alarm some, infuriate others, and spark the kind of whispers that could bruise reputations beyond repair. The steward bowed without comment, though his eyes flickered with the apprehension of a man who had witnessed scandals destroy families far less prominent than the Blackwells. Arian was given a chamber overlooking the gardens, its hearth burning brightly as though in defiance of the cold she had fled. She touched the embroidered coverlet, overwhelmed by the realization that she was safe, yet burdened by the knowledge that safety purchased at another's risk carried its own weight of guilt. From the window she glimpsed Alexander speaking with his steward in low tones, likely issuing orders meant to shield her from intrusion. Though his expression remained inscrutable, she sensed the tension tightening the lines of his posture. Her arrival had not merely interrupted his evening. It had thrust him into the heart of a conflict that could threaten his political alliances and the carefully cultivated authority he wielded in aristocratic circles. Still, he made no hint of regret. Instead, when the steward delivered a tray of broth and bread, Arian found a folded note placed beside it, written in the Duke's steady hand, "Rest without fear. No harm will reach you here." The following morning brought the first sign that the outside world would not allow her refuge to remain unnoticed. A footman arrived breathless with news from London. Rumors had already taken flight, suggesting that Lady Arian Hargrave had fled into the arms of the Duke not from desperation but from desire. Such whispers spread with the ferocity of wildfire, twisting truth into something unrecognizable. Lady Marianne, Arian's stepmother, had reportedly fueled the scandal by claiming her stepdaughter had sought to manipulate the Duke's affections to avoid her duty-bound marriage. The notion was so absurd that Arian almost laughed, though the sound caught painfully in her throat. She knew how swiftly gossip could calcify into public verdict, and how little mercy society extended to young women who strayed beyond the boundaries prescribed for them. When Alexander entered the breakfast room, he carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man accustomed to weathering storms, yet there was an unmistakable strain beneath his composed exterior. He informed her that Viscount Redmayne had lodged a formal complaint, accusing the Duke of abducting his future bride and violating the sanctity of an aristocratic engagement. Arian felt the words strike her like stones. She had escaped humiliation only to see another man suffer because he had chosen to protect her. Watching Alexander pour tea with meticulous calm, she wondered whether he regretted that choice. But when his gaze lifted to hers, there was no judgment, only a steady understanding that unsettled her more than anger might have. He assured her that he would address the allegations and that the truth of her coerced engagement would come to light, though he acknowledged the legal process would be arduous. Days passed within a delicate balance of secrecy and quiet companionship. Arian found solace in the Manor's library, where shelves of leather-bound volumes offered her a refuge of stories untouched by scandal. She spent mornings reading near the tall windows, tracing the outlines of worlds that required no explanations from her. One afternoon, as she examined an atlas, Alexander approached, his shadow falling gently across the map. He presented her with a journal bound in soft, dark leather, explaining that he believed every person deserved a place to record their thoughts unfiltered by fear. She accepted the gift with gratitude deeper than words could convey. It was not a lavish token but an affirmation that her voice mattered. The gesture softened something within her, a part of her spirit that had been bruised by years of silenced objections. In turn, Alexander began revealing fragments of his inner life, though always with restraint. He spoke of the expectations borne by a man whose title made him both admired and watched. Every decision he made was scrutinized, and every rumor surrounding him was amplified. Yet he confessed that he would not retract his decision to shelter her, even if the cost proved steep. Arian felt the weight of his sincerity in the air between them. She found herself studying the subtle emotions that crossed his features when he believed himself unobserved, the quiet protectiveness, the contemplative shadows, the flicker of something warmer when she smiled. Their conversations deepened into an intimacy neither acknowledged aloud, shaped by shared moments rather than declarations. Meanwhile, the scandal beyond the manor walls swelled like an approaching tide. Newspapers speculated on Arian's disappearance, some suggesting she had been kidnapped, others insinuating she had willingly compromised herself. Lady Marianne's embellished accounts only worsened the tumult, painting Arian as manipulative and ungrateful. Alexander's advisers urged him to distance himself from her to preserve his political alliances, yet he dismissed each recommendation with an unwavering resolve that startled even those accustomed to his authority. His determination, though admirable, worried Arian profoundly. She could not bear the thought that her struggle for freedom might erode the reputation of the one man who had offered her kindness without condition. One evening, Alexander returned from London with news that Viscount Redmayne had petitioned the Crown to take immediate action against him. The accusation cast a heavy pall over the manor, and Arian felt her breath tighten as she imagined the consequences. Yet Alexander's composure remained intact, though she detected the weariness beneath it. As they spoke beside the crackling hearth, he reassured her that he would withstand whatever inquiries or judgments awaited him. The flickering firelight revealed a sincerity that made her chest ache with gratitude. But before he could say more, a footman arrived with a confidential letter bearing the wax seal of the Chancellor's office. Alexander read it silently, his expression sharpening into something unreadable. When he finally looked up, he met Arian's anxious gaze and said only that matters would soon escalate. The uncertainty pressed upon them both, weaving tension into every quiet moment they shared. Yet beneath the unease, something unmistakable had begun to flourish between them, fragile but undeniable, like a blossom opening despite the threat of frost. Arian sensed that their connection, though unspoken, had already bound their fates more tightly than either had intended. The night's final ember burned low as Alexander walked her to her chamber, offering a reassuring nod before departing down the dim corridor. She lingered at her doorway, watching the shadows lengthen behind him. Though danger gathered beyond the manor walls, she felt an emerging certainty that whatever lay ahead, her life had shifted irrevocably the moment she had run into his arms. The storm that swept across Ravensworth Manor that night seemed almost summoned by the unrest tightening within its walls, a tempest echoing the turmoil neither Arian nor Alexander dared speak aloud. Wind lashed against the tall windows, and the corridors flickered with candlelight wavering under each low rumble of thunder. The manor, usually a bastion of order and ancestral pride, felt momentarily removed from the world beyond its gates, as though suspended in a breath between danger and revelation. Arian moved quietly through the dim passageway, her shawl gathered tight around her shoulders, unsettled by an unease that had followed her since the Chancellor's sealed letter arrived. She had heard servants whispering near the stairwell, their tones hushed with apprehension, and she sensed that the fragile shield Alexander had placed between her and scandal was beginning to strain beneath forces greater than rumor alone. She found him in the library, standing near the hearth as though the flames offered some counsel he could not find elsewhere. The fire cast a warm glow across his features, softening the severity that duty often imposed upon them, yet she could tell the day had worn heavily upon him. When he turned toward her, his expression held a depth of fatigue she had never before seen in him. He invited her closer with a gesture, but not with the practiced politeness of a duke receiving a guest. Rather, with the weary openness of a man who had reached the limits of solitude. She stepped toward him, drawn by a mixture of gratitude and concern that blurred the boundaries she had tried so carefully to maintain. The storm grew louder, and the windows shuddered in their frames. He offered her a chair near the hearth, but she remained standing, sensing that the moment demanded honesty rather than comfort. She asked, with more courage than she felt, what new threat the Chancellor's correspondence had brought. Alexander hesitated, the silence stretching between them like the tension before a bowstring snaps. At last he admitted that Redmayne's accusations had stirred more than gossip. They had prompted Parliament to question his motives, and several members now doubted whether a man of his influence should act so independently in matters involving another noble family. Arian felt herself pale, understanding that she was not merely the center of a scandal. She had become the fulcrum upon which his reputation now tilted. She apologized, the words spilling out in a rush shaped by guilt and fear. But Alexander stepped nearer, refusing her remorse with a quiet intensity. He told her she bore no blame for seeking refuge, nor for the cruelty of those who had exploited her vulnerability. What he regretted, he confessed, was that he had not foreseen how swiftly her enemies would twist their narratives to ensnare them both. His voice carried neither anger nor reproach, only the solemn gravity of a man who had accepted consequences long before speaking them aloud. The candor of his admission struck her deeply, unraveling the careful composure she had maintained since the night she fled. She felt her throat tighten as she realized how profoundly his life had been altered because he had chosen to shield hers. Unable to contain the weight of her past any longer, she told him the full truth of her stepmother's manipulation, how Lady Marianne had slowly dismantled every remnant of autonomy she possessed. She recounted the letters intercepted, the friendships discouraged, the suitors dismissed under fabricated scandals. She spoke of her mother's inheritance, locked behind legal complexities that Marianne had twisted to her advantage. As Arian's voice trembled through each revelation, Alexander listened with unwavering attention, his expression darkening with indignation not at her, but at the injustice she had endured in silence. When she finished, a fragile stillness settled between them, heavy yet strangely liberating. It was the first time she had spoken her history without fear of contradiction or punishment. He approached slowly, as though wary of startling the vulnerability she had laid before him. When he spoke, his tone carried a gentleness uncommon for a man accustomed to commanding rooms with a single word. He told her that no one should have to bear such cruelty alone, and that he admired the strength she had shown despite her circumstances. The sincerity of his voice, quiet yet resolute, pierced through the barriers she had painstakingly constructed to protect herself. For the first time since arriving at Ravensworth Manor, she sensed that he saw not merely a fugitive from scandal, but a woman whose dignity had survived attempts to crush it. The fire crackled softly, and the shadows lengthened around them, drawing them closer into a world of their own making. When their hands brushed as she reached for the journal he had gifted her, the contact sent a jolt of awareness through them both. Neither withdrew. Instead, their hands remained lightly joined, the simple touch charged with more meaning than any confession they had yet spoken. He looked at her with a gravity that made her pulse falter, and she recognized in his gaze the same fragile longing she had tried to ignore within herself. Yet before either could voice the sentiment that hovered between them, a sharp rap sounded at the door. The solicitor entered, his face pale from travel and worry. He carried documents bearing evidence of Viscount Redmayne's fraudulent dealings, proof that could unravel the engagement forced upon her. Relief surged through Arian, tempered by the realization that this discovery had likely come at great personal risk to those assisting Alexander. As the solicitor explained the potential repercussion for Redmayne, Alexander's attention shifted discreetly toward her. She understood that he had pursued this investigation not merely out of duty but out of a devotion he had never allowed himself to name. When the solicitor departed and the door closed once more, the room felt smaller, more intimate, as though the revelation had altered its very air. Arian turned to Alexander, her heart pounding with the weight of a question she had long suppressed. She asked him why he would risk so much, his standing, his alliances, his carefully cultivated authority, for the sake of a woman society believed beneath his concern. His expression softened, yet beneath his calm she sensed a turbulence he struggled to contain. He stepped toward her, his voice quiet but thick with restrained emotion, telling her that some decisions defied reason and belonged solely to the truth one carried within. But he stopped himself there, the confession catching on the brink of revelation, held back by the lingering fear that naming his feelings might endanger them both. The storm outside seemed to pause, the world holding its breath as though urging him to continue. Yet he offered only silence, a silence filled with everything he could not yet bring himself to speak. And though the moment passed without a declaration, its gravity lingered between them, drawing them irrevocably closer even as uncertainty coiled tighter around their future. Still, Arian felt something within her shift, like the first glimmer of dawn easing the heaviness of night. For the first time since her escape, she sensed that she was no longer navigating her peril alone. Whatever storms awaited them, both within the manor and beyond its gates, she felt a growing certainty that their fates had entwined in ways neither had anticipated, yet neither wished to undo. The fire dimmed to a warm glow, and as she stepped from the library, she knew that the truth neither had spoken now pulsed like a secret heartbeat between them, urging its way toward the light. Morning broke over London with a pale, hesitant light, as though even the sun sensed the precarious balance upon which the fate of two lives rested. The Crown Court of Chancery filled quickly, its gallery crowded with nobles eager for spectacle, their expressions sharpened by the promise of scandal. Arian entered on Alexander's arm, her steps measured yet trembling beneath the weight of so many watchful eyes. Whispers rippled through the chamber at the sight of them. Some saw impropriety, others witnessed courage. Alexander offered no acknowledgment to any of them, though a faint tension in his jaw revealed the storm he held carefully contained. For Arian, merely walking beside him felt like a declaration of trust louder than any words she could speak. Her heart pounded as she took her seat, knowing the truth she carried would soon determine not only her future but his. The hearing commenced with an air of icy formality. Viscount Redmayne rose first, painting himself as a wronged suitor deprived of his rightful bride. He claimed that Arian had been manipulated by a powerful man with selfish intentions, insinuating that Alexander had acted from desire rather than protection. His voice, thick with wounded pride, wove a narrative designed to ensnare sympathy. Many in the gallery murmured in agreement, eager to believe a version of events that punished boldness and rewarded authority. Arian's hands tightened in her lap, but Alexander remained still beside her, radiating a steadiness that reminded her she no longer faced this trial alone. When Arian was called forward, the room shifted. She stood with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured far more than the court could imagine. Her voice did not tremble as she recounted the coercion she had suffered under Lady Marianne's rule, the manipulation of her inheritance, and the forced engagement engineered without her consent. She spoke plainly, refusing embellishment, allowing truth alone to guide her. As she described the fear that had driven her into the gardens that night, a hush settled across the chamber. Even the most skeptical observers seemed momentarily stripped of their judgment. Arian concluded her testimony with a simple statement. She sought freedom, not scandal, and the Duke had granted her shelter without ever asking for loyalty in return. Then came the solicitor's evidence. Documents revealing Redmayne's fraudulent dealings, his attempts to acquire property through coercion, and his conversations with Lady Marianne discussing Arian's inheritance as though it were an object for barter. Gasps erupted through the court. Redmayne's facade cracked visibly, his bluster dissolving into panicked denial. The Chancellor, stern and deliberate, reviewed the evidence with unambiguous disapproval. His ruling was swift. The engagement was annulled, Lady Marianne's authority over Arian's estate was voided, and Redmayne's petition against the Duke was dismissed as unfounded. The decision carried a finality that seemed to resound through every marble pillar. Arian felt a rush of breath escape her, a liberation so profound she momentarily forgot the room around her. Yet before she could gather herself, Alexander rose. The chamber turned silent once more, drawn to him as though the very air recognized the gravity of what he intended. He approached the bench not with arrogance but with solemn purpose. He acknowledged the court's judgment, then spoke words no one expected. He admitted that although his actions had begun from duty and compassion, they had grown into something far deeper, something that surpassed reputation, title, or fear of scandal. He asked not for Arian's obligation but for the honor of her heart, should she choose to give it freely. The declaration struck through the hall like a soft clap of thunder, shocking in its humility and its boldness. Some gasped, others stared, spellbound. Arian felt her pulse quicken as every gaze shifted toward her. Yet in that suspended moment, the noise of the gallery faded, replaced by the memory of the countless silent kindnesses Alexander had offered, the journal he placed in her hands, the cloak wrapped around her trembling shoulders, the unwavering belief that her freedom mattered more than the whispers of society. When she stepped toward him, her voice was steady, born not of relief but of certainty. She told him she had fled seeking a refuge from captivity, and in him, she had found not only protection but a partnership built upon respect, bravery, and truth. She accepted him, not because he was a duke, but because he had seen her with unclouded eyes when the world had looked away. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Some applauded, moved by the rare sincerity of their exchange. Others whispered disapproval behind gloved hands. Yet none of it mattered. The choice had been made by the only two people whose lives would be shaped by it. Alexander offered his arm once more, and Arian took it with a quiet pride that eclipsed every humiliation she had endured. They exited the chamber not as fugitives of scandal but as individuals who had reclaimed their narrative from the grasp of others. Their wedding followed weeks later at Ravensworth Manor, a ceremony bathed in candlelight and the fragrance of early spring roses. The vows they exchanged were simple yet profound, promising partnership rather than obedience, and devotion without possession. As Arian stood with Alexander beneath the archway of the great hall, she felt the remnants of her past fall away like shadows dissolving in morning light. Guests spoke of their union as a story that defied society's cruelty, yet neither she nor Alexander sought admiration. They wanted only the quiet certainty of a future shaped by their own choosing. As they walked out into the sunlight together, the world seemed brighter, not because fortune had favored them, but because they had dared to choose truth over fear. And though history would remember Alexander as a powerful duke and Arian as the runaway bride who challenged expectation, their greatest legacy was something far simpler. Two lives entwined not by arrangement or duty, but by the courage to love freely in a world that often forbade it.